You are being released today. Go home. You've paid more than enough.
I don't have a home. Everyone's gone. Who do I go back to? Who's waiting for me? I forgot what it feels like to be held.
Robert Franklin Hayes walked out of Menard Correctional Center after 40 years of incarceration, released by judicial order at 73 years old, with a spotless record and every rehabilitation program completed. But what he didn't have was a home, a job, proper identification, or a single person waiting for him on the outside. Within 24 hours, Hayes would be homeless and hungry, turned away from the only transitional housing on his list, sleeping on a Chicago bench with $34 to his name. The 12 months that followed would expose the catastrophic gap between legal freedom and actual reentry, the invisible cruelty of releasing elderly prisoners into a world that had moved on without them, and the impossible task of rebuilding a life from nothing when the system designed to help had no interest in his survival. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. Judge Raymond Caldwell had been on the Cook County Circuit Court bench for 19 years when he opened the file for people of the state of Illinois versus Hayes on that gray Thursday morning in March. He was 62 years old, a former prosecutor who had spent 12 years in the state's attorney's office before his appointment to the bench. He had a reputation for being methodical, deliberate, and fair. A judge who read every page of every motion, who asked clarifying questions, who took his time. His colleagues respected him. Defense attorneys trusted him to follow the law even when public pressure demanded otherwise. Prosecutors knew he wouldn't be swayed by emotion or politics. The case before him was a resentencing hearing triggered by Illinois Senate Bill 2259, passed in 2021, which allowed judicial review of sentences imposed before 1990 for offenses committed by defendants under the age of 25. The statute was designed to address what lawmakers and advocacy groups called de facto life sentences, imposed on young offenders during the height of the tough-on-crime era, sentences that reflected mandatory minimums and prosecutorial discretion, unchecked by considerations of youth, maturity, or rehabilitation potential. The law didn't guarantee release. It simply gave judges the authority to reconsider whether a sentence remained proportionate after decades of incarceration. Caldwell had presided over 11 resentencing hearings in the past 18 months. He had granted relief in 3 cases, all involving nonviolent offenses or offenders who had been juveniles at the time of their crimes. He had denied relief in 8 cases, most of them involving violence, victim opposition, or disciplinary records that raised concerns about public safety. He approached each case individually, weighing the statutory factors against the reality of the crime and the documented transformation, or lack thereof, of the person sitting before him. Robert Franklin Hayes was not a typical petitioner. He had been convicted of felony murder, one of the most legally and morally complex charges in the Illinois Criminal Code. Under Illinois law, anyone who participated in a felony during which another person was killed could be charged with murder, regardless of whether they personally caused the death or even intended for anyone to die. The statute was designed to hold accomplices accountable for the foreseeable consequences of dangerous criminal activity. Critics argued it swept too broadly, capturing getaway drivers, lookouts, and co-defendants who were present but not culpable in the same way as the person who pulled the trigger. Hayes had been 22 years old on the night of August 14, 1984, when he drove his 1978 Chevrolet Impala to a Shell gas station on the corner of 79th Street and Ashland Avenue on Chicago's South Side. It was 11:47 p.m. The station was nearly empty, and the overnight clerk, Leonard Chun, was restocking cigarettes behind the counter. Hayes parked the car near the entrance, engine running. His co-defendant, Marcus Thompson, entered the station wearing a dark hoodie and carrying a .38 caliber revolver. Thompson demanded money from the register. Chun complied immediately, opening the drawer and stepping back with his hands raised. Thompson grabbed the cash, $273, and turned to leave. As he reached the door, Chun moved toward the phone mounted on the wall behind the counter, reaching for the receiver to call the police. Thompson turned back and fired twice. One bullet struck Chun in the chest, piercing his left lung and severing the pulmonary artery. He collapsed behind the counter, bleeding out in less than 3 minutes. Thompson ran to the car, shouting at Hayes to drive. Hayes accelerated out of the parking lot, tires screeching, running a red light at the intersection. A patrol car 2 blocks away heard the shots and responded within 90 seconds. They found Leonard Chen dead on the floor. Surveillance footage captured the entire sequence. Thompson entering, the robbery, the shooting, Thompson fleeing to the waiting Impala. Chicago police detectives identified the vehicle within 6 hours using the surveillance tape and witness descriptions. Hayes's Impala was registered in his mother's name but was known to be driven exclusively by him. Officers located the car parked outside his mother's apartment building in Englewood at 7:20 a.m. the following morning. Hayes was inside the apartment, sleeping. Thompson was gone. Officers arrested Hayes on the spot, charging him with armed robbery and felony murder. They found Thompson 3 days later hiding in a cousin's basement on the west side. Both men were charged identically. 2 counts of first-degree murder under the felony murder rule, 1 count of armed robbery, and 1 count of unlawful use of a weapon. The Cook County State's Attorney's Office pursued the case aggressively. It was 1984, the height of the crack epidemic, the beginning of a national panic over urban crime, and a period when prosecutors across the country were adopting zero-tolerance policies and pursuing maximum sentences as a deterrent. The state offered Hayes a plea deal: plead guilty to armed robbery and second-degree murder, testify against Thompson, receive 20 years. Hayes refused. His court-appointed attorney, a 31-year-old public defender named Jonathan Pierce who was handling 18 other cases simultaneously, advised him that the evidence was overwhelming and that going to trial risked a life sentence. Hayes insisted he hadn't known Thompson was going to shoot anyone, that he thought it was just a robbery, that he was terrified and didn't know what to do when Thompson came running out. Pierce explained that under Illinois felony murder law, Hayes's knowledge or intent regarding the shooting was legally irrelevant. By participating in the armed robbery, Hayes had assumed legal responsibility for any death that occurred during the commission of that felony. The jury wouldn't need to find that Hayes intended to kill Leonard Chen or even that he knew Thompson might shoot. They only needed to find that Hayes knowingly participated in an armed robbery and that a death occurred during that robbery. Pierce urged Hayes to take the plea. Hayes, young and terrified and convinced that the truth would matter, refused. The trial began on January 14, 1985, in Cook County Circuit Court. The prosecution presented surveillance footage, forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Hayes's own statements to police in which he admitted driving Thompson to and from the gas station. The defense presented no witnesses. Pierce's strategy, such as it was, focused on arguing that Hayes was merely the driver, that he didn't enter the store, that he didn't touch the gun, and that he shouldn't be held responsible for Thompson's decision to shoot. The judge instructed the jury on the felony murder rule, explaining that under Illinois law, all participants in a felony are legally responsible for any deaths that occur during that felony, regardless of who directly caused the death. The jury deliberated for 3 hours and 47 minutes. They returned guilty verdicts on all counts for both Hayes and Thompson. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. Leonard Chen's widow, Susan Chen, gave a victim impact statement, describing her husband as a hardworking immigrant who had fled violence in Taiwan, who worked 16-hour days to support his family, who had dreams of seeing his daughters graduate from college. She looked directly at Hayes and Thompson as she spoke. "You took everything from us. My husband never hurt anyone. He gave you the money. You didn't have to kill him." The judge sentenced both men to life without the possibility of parole under Illinois law, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder at that time. Hayes's mother, seated in the gallery, let out a single anguished sob. Hayes stared straight ahead, his face expressionless, his hands cuffed in front of him. He was 22 years old. He would not be eligible for release unless the law changed or a court intervened. Do you think the felony murder rule holds accomplices fairly accountable? Or does it impose life sentences on people who never intended to kill? Drop your answer below. Hayes was transported to Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois, a maximum security facility built in 1925 and notorious for its panopticon design, overcrowding, gang violence, and complete absence of rehabilitative programming. He was assigned to a 6-by-9-foot cell in F House, a cell block housing over 300 men convicted of murder, most of them serving life sentences. The cell contained a metal bunk bed bolted to the wall, a stainless steel toilet with no seat, a small metal sink, and a narrow shelf. Hayes shared the cell with a man serving life for a double homicide. The man barely spoke. Hayes learned quickly to do the same. The first year was survival. Stateville in the mid-1980s was a pressure cooker of violence, racial tension, and gang control. The Gangster Disciples, Latin Kings, Vice Lords, and other street organizations ran entire cell blocks, controlling contraband, extortion, and the informal economy of cigarettes, drugs, and protection. Hayes had no gang affiliation, no connections, and no money on his books. He was vulnerable. Within 3 months, he was beaten twice by members of a gang that controlled his cell block, once for refusing to carry contraband, once for simply being in the wrong place when tensions exploded into violence. Hayes learned to keep his head down, to move through the prison invisibly, to avoid eye contact, to speak only when necessary. He worked in the prison laundry, earning 14 cents an hour, folding industrial-sized loads of sheets and towels in a hot, poorly ventilated room for 8 hours a day. The work was mind-numbing, the pay meaningless, but it kept him out of his cell and away from the worst of the violence. He sent his mother a letter every 2 weeks, brief and factual, telling her he was okay, asking about his younger sister, avoiding any mention of what life inside was actually like. His mother visited once, 6 months after his sentencing. She sat across from him in the visiting room, separated by a plexiglass barrier, and cried for the entire 30-minute visit. Hayes told her not to come back. It was too far, too expensive, too painful. She never came again. Marcus Thompson, Hayes's co-defendant, was housed in a different cell block. They saw each other occasionally in the yard or the chow hall but never spoke. Thompson was killed in 1987 during a gang-related stabbing in the yard. Hayes heard about it through the prison grapevine. He felt nothing, no grief, no anger, no relief. Thompson had destroyed both their lives in 3 seconds of panic and rage, and now he was gone. Hayes was still there. The years blurred together. Hayes turned 30 in prison, then 40, then 50. He had no visits, no phone calls, no contact with anyone outside except his mother's occasional letters, which became less frequent as she aged and her health declined. She died in 1998 from complications related to diabetes. Hayes's sister, Renee, sent him a brief letter informing him of the death and the funeral arrangements. Hayes requested permission to attend the funeral under escort. The warden denied the request, citing security concerns and the cost of transporting a maximum security inmate. Hayes sat in his cell the day of his mother's funeral and stared at the wall. But something shifted in Hayes during those middle years, a slow, almost imperceptible transformation that had nothing to do with redemption or forgiveness and everything to do with survival and the refusal to let prison destroy him completely. He enrolled in every educational program Stateville offered, which wasn't many. He completed his GED in 1989, scoring in the 92nd percentile. He took a community college correspondence course in basic accounting, completing it over 2 years by mailing assignments to an instructor he never met. He volunteered for a prison literacy program, teaching other inmates how to read using donated books and materials so outdated they referenced presidents who had been dead for decades. In 1995, Hayes was transferred to Menard Correctional Center in Chester, Illinois, a medium security facility in the southern part of the state, 4 hours from Chicago. The transfer was part of a system-wide effort to reduce overcrowding at Stateville and to separate long-term, non-violent inmates from the gang-controlled chaos of maximum security. Menard was still a prison, still violent, still dehumanizing, but it offered something Stateville never had: rehabilitative programming. Hayes enrolled in vocational training, learning carpentry and basic electrical work. He joined a substance abuse counseling program even though he had never used drugs, simply because the facilitator was a retired social worker who treated the men like human beings, and the meetings offered 2 hours a week of conversation that wasn't about violence or survival. Hayes maintained a clean disciplinary record for 22 consecutive years, an extraordinary achievement in an environment designed to provoke conflict. He avoided gangs, avoided fights, avoided the underground economy of contraband and favors. He was quiet, respectful, and invisible. Corrections officers who worked his unit barely remembered his name. He was inmate #R18473, a number and a file, a man serving life without parole for felony murder, a man the system had written off decades ago. Judge Caldwell had read all of this in the resentencing motion filed by Maria Santos, Hayes' public defender. The motion was thorough, well-researched, and persuasive, arguing that Hayes' sentence was disproportionate given his age at the time of the offense, his role as the driver rather than the shooter, his lack of prior criminal history, his 40 years of incarceration, and his documented transformation. The motion included letters of support from prison counselors, educators, and even correctional officers who described Hayes as respectful, hardworking, and rehabilitated. It included a psychological evaluation conducted by a forensic psychologist who assessed Hayes as posing minimal risk of reoffending and suffering from chronic health conditions including hypertension, arthritis, and early-stage kidney disease. The prosecution's response was brief and predictable. The state opposed resentencing, arguing that Hayes had been convicted of felony murder, that a man had died, that the victim's family opposed release, and that the original sentence reflected the seriousness of the crime. The state's attorney noted that Hayes had refused a plea deal that would have resulted in his release years ago, and that his decision to go to trial reflected a lack of remorse and accountability. The response did not address Hayes' conduct during incarceration, his age, or his health. Judge Caldwell reviewed both submissions, the trial transcript, the sentencing hearing transcript, and the institutional records documenting Hayes' 40 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. He read the victim impact statement submitted by Susan Chen's daughter, now 51 years old, who wrote that her father's death had shattered their family, that her mother had never recovered, and that releasing Hayes would dishonor her father's memory. He read Hayes' own handwritten letter, submitted as part of the motion, in which Hayes expressed remorse for his role in Leonard Chen's death, acknowledged that no amount of time could undo the harm, and stated that he thought every day about the man who died and the family he left behind. Caldwell spent 3 weeks considering the motion before scheduling the hearing. He knew his decision would be criticized regardless of the outcome. If he granted relief, the media would accuse him of being soft on crime, of releasing a murderer, of prioritizing the rights of criminals over the suffering of victims. If he denied relief, advocates would accuse him of ignoring the law, of perpetuating mass incarceration, of condemning an elderly, rehabilitated man to die in prison for a crime he committed at 22 under a legal theory that held him responsible for another person's actions. Now, standing in the courtroom on that gray Thursday morning in March, Judge Caldwell looked at Robert Franklin Hayes and saw a 73-year-old man who had spent more of his life incarcerated than free, a man who had entered prison as a young, desperate, foolish participant in a robbery and was leaving as an elderly, broken shell of a person. "Mr. Hayes, please stand," Judge Caldwell said, his voice measured and deliberate. Hayes rose slowly, his hands trembling slightly. He was thin, his hair completely white, his shoulders rounded forward from decades of institutional posture. His public defender, Maria Santos, stood beside him, her hands folded in front of her, her expression carefully neutral. "Mr. Hayes," Judge Caldwell began, "I have reviewed the materials submitted by your counsel, the state's response, and the record of your incarceration. I have considered the statutory factors outlined in Senate Bill 2259, including your age at the time of the offense, your role in the underlying crime, your conduct during incarceration, your lack of prior criminal history, and the evolving standards regarding proportionality in sentencing." He paused, glancing at the prosecutor, Assistant State's Attorney Jennifer Kwan, who sat with her arms crossed, her face tight with disapproval. "The crime you participated in resulted in the death of an innocent man. That fact is not diminished by the passage of time. Leonard Chen's family has submitted a statement opposing your release, and their pain is both understandable and profound. However, the law now requires me to consider whether your original sentence, life without the possibility of parole, remains proportionate given the totality of circumstances." Judge Caldwell removed his glasses, setting them on the bench. The courtroom was completely silent. "I find that it does not. You have served 40 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. You were not the shooter. You did not enter the store. You did not touch the weapon. You were the driver, and under the felony murder rule, you were held legally responsible for a death you did not cause and may not have foreseen. You were 22 years old, unemployed, desperate, and you made a catastrophic decision that cost a man his life and cost you your freedom. Maria Santos felt her pulse quicken. She had argued dozens of these motions. Most ended in denial. You have maintained a clean disciplinary record for 22 consecutive years. You have completed every available rehabilitative program. You have earned your GED, completed vocational training, and volunteered as a literacy tutor. The psychological evaluation describes you as posing minimal risk to public safety. You are 73 years old, in declining health, and you have served a sentence longer than many people convicted of intentional murder. Judge Caldwell leaned forward slightly, looking directly at Hayes. Therefore, pursuant to the authority granted under Illinois statute, I am resentencing you to 40 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. Your sentence is deemed served as of today. You are ordered released immediately, subject to 3 years of supervised parole and compliance with all conditions established by the Illinois Prisoner Review Board. He picked up his gavel. This court is adjourned. The gavel struck once, the sound echoing through the small courtroom. Hayes didn't move. He stared at Judge Caldwell, his mouth slightly open, his hands still gripping the edge of the table. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing shallow and uneven. Maria Santos touched his shoulder gently. Robert, you're free. You're going home. Hayes turned to look at her, his eyes filling with tears that didn't fall, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't have a home. The processing took 6 hours. Hayes was transported back to Menard Correctional Center, the facility where he had spent the last 29 years of his life, where he knew every guard, every routine, every sound. He was fingerprinted again, photographed again, his biometric data entered into the Illinois Department of Corrections release database. A corrections officer he recognized, a man named Officer Dennis Clark who had worked Hayes' cell block for 12 years, handed him a standard release package in a large manila envelope. Inside was $75 in gate money, a 10, a 20, 3 10s, and a 5, issued by the state as a nominal gesture toward reentry support. There was a bus voucher for transportation from the facility to the nearest Greyhound station in Marion, Illinois. There was a single change of civilian clothing donated by a nonprofit reentry organization. Dark blue jeans with an elastic waistband, a gray sweatshirt with a faded logo for a company that no longer existed, white sneakers 2 sizes too large, and a thin navy blue windbreaker. Everything smelled like industrial detergent and long-term storage. There was a printed list of halfway houses and reentry resource centers in Cook County, most of them with addresses Hayes didn't recognize in neighborhoods he couldn't picture. There was a pamphlet titled Your First Days of Freedom, a reentry guide produced by the Illinois Department of Corrections, filled with generic advice about finding housing, applying for benefits, and avoiding old influences. Hayes' personal property, accumulated over 40 years, fit into a single clear plastic bag. A wristwatch that had stopped working in 1997, 3 photographs. One of his mother taken in 1983, one of his sister Renee's high school graduation in 1981, and one of himself as a child, and a small spiral notebook filled with pencil sketches of birds he had observed in the prison yard over the decades. Cardinals, sparrows, crows, mourning doves. He had taught himself to draw by studying a library book on wildlife illustration, copying the diagrams over and over until his hands remembered the shapes. Officer Clark led Hayes to the discharge area, a small room with concrete walls, fluorescent lights, and a single metal bench. Change into the civilian clothes, Clark said, not unkindly. Leave the DOC uniform here. Hayes undressed slowly, folding the khaki shirt and pants into a neat pile on the bench, a habit ingrained by 40 years of inspections. He pulled on the donated jeans, the sweatshirt, the sneakers. The clothes hung loosely on his thin frame. The sneakers flopped with each step. He looked down at himself and felt ridiculous, like a child wearing his father's clothing. Officer Clark handed him a form. Sign here acknowledging receipt of your release materials and personal property. Hayes signed with a shaking hand. You got somebody picking you up? Clark asked. No, sir. Clark nodded. Bus station's about 4 miles south. The voucher's good for 1 trip to Chicago. After that, you're on your own. At 4:15 p.m., another corrections officer unlocked the final door and pushed it open. Hayes stepped through, holding the plastic bag and the manila envelope, and stood on the sidewalk outside Menard Correctional Center. The air was cold, the sky gray and overcast. Traffic moved along Route 3 in the distance. He could hear a dog barking somewhere, the hum of a truck engine, the wind moving through the bare trees. He stood there for several minutes, unable to move, unable to process the absence of walls, of locked doors, of voices shouting orders. His legs felt unsteady. His chest felt tight. His hands were shaking so badly he nearly dropped the plastic bag. A bus stop sign stood 30 yards away at the intersection. Hayes walked toward it slowly, his breathing labored, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. He sat down on the metal bench and waited. The bus arrived 43 minutes later, a regional transit bus with faded paint and advertisements for personal injury lawyers. Hayes climbed aboard, handed the driver his voucher, and took a seat near the back. The bus smelled like diesel fuel and fast food. There were 7 other passengers, most of them staring at their phones, earbuds in, completely disconnected from the world around them. Hayes had never seen people so absorbed in small glowing screens. The last time he had ridden a bus, in 1984, people read newspapers or stared out the window. He pressed his forehead against the cold glass and watched southern Illinois pass by. Farmland, small towns, gas stations, fast food restaurants with names he didn't recognize. Billboards advertising products he'd never heard of. Everything looked different. The cars were rounder, quieter. The buildings were newer. Even the sky looked different, though he couldn't explain why. The bus dropped him at the Greyhound station in Marion at 5:30 p.m. The station was small, just a waiting room with plastic chairs and a ticket counter. Hayes approached the counter, his hands still trembling. "I need a ticket to Chicago." The clerk, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes, glanced at his voucher. "This gets you as far as Carbondale. You'll need to buy a separate ticket from there to Chicago. $38. Hayes opened the manila envelope and counted out 2 20s from his gate money. The clerk handed him a ticket and $7 in change. "Bus leaves in 40 minutes. Gate 3. Hayes sat in the waiting room, surrounded by people traveling with luggage, backpacks, shopping bags. He had a plastic bag containing 3 photographs and a notebook. That was all he owned. 40 years of life reduced to objects that fit in one hand. The bus to Carbondale took 90 minutes. The bus from Carbondale to Chicago took 5 hours, with stops in Mount Vernon, Effingham, Champaign, and Kankakee. Hayes didn't sleep. He couldn't. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the panic of confinement, the muscle memory of hypervigilance, the reflex to wake at the slightest sound. He arrived at the Chicago Greyhound station on West Harrison Street at 1:20 a.m., exhausted, disoriented, and terrified. The station was crowded even at that hour. People sleeping on benches, security guards watching monitors, announcements crackling over loudspeakers. Hayes stood in the middle of the terminal, holding his plastic bag and his remaining $37, trying to remember the Chicago he had left 40 years ago. This wasn't it. The station had been renovated. The surrounding neighborhood looked completely different through the windows. The streets were full of new buildings, new signs, new everything. He approached a security guard, a young man in a uniform, maybe 25 years old. "Excuse me, sir. I need to find this address." He pulled out the printed list of halfway houses from the manila envelope, his hand shaking so badly the paper rattled. The guard glanced at it. "That's on the south side, near Garfield Park. You'll need the Green Line or a bus. CTA fare is $2.50. Hayes stared at him. "CTA? Chicago Transit Authority. The train." The guard pointed toward the exit. "Station's 2 blocks east. Should a person leaving prison after 40 years receive more than $75 and a bus voucher to rebuild their entire life? Drop your answer below." Hayes walked through the dark streets of Chicago at 1:30 a.m., clutching his plastic bag, terrified of every person he passed, every car that slowed down, every shadow. The city had changed. Buildings he remembered were gone. Entire blocks had been torn down and rebuilt. The people looked different, dressed different, moved different. Everyone was looking at phones. Everyone had earbuds. Everyone moved fast, with purpose, ignoring him completely. He found the train station, an underground entrance with a glowing sign. He descended the stairs and stood in front of a ticket machine, staring at the digital screen displaying options he didn't understand. Touch to purchase fare. Select ticket type. Insert payment. The interface made no sense. He pressed random icons, hoping something would work. Nothing happened. A young woman standing behind him sighed loudly. "Are you going to use that, or what?" Hayes stepped aside, his face burning with shame. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to." The woman stepped forward, swiped her card against a sensor he hadn't noticed, and walked through a turnstile. She didn't look back. Hayes stood there for 15 minutes, watching other people use the machine, trying to understand the sequence. Finally, an older man, maybe 60, approached him. "You need help?" "Yes, sir. I need to buy a ticket." The man showed him how to select the fare, insert the bills, collect the card. Hayes thanked him, his voice thick with gratitude and humiliation. He swiped the card, pushed through the turnstile, and descended another set of stairs to the platform. The train arrived 10 minutes later, screeching into the station with a sound that made Hayes flinch. The doors opened. He stepped inside a brightly lit car with plastic seats and digital displays showing the route. He sat near the door, gripping the plastic bag, watching the city pass by through the windows. Glowing buildings, empty streets, the elevated track suspended above neighborhoods he didn't recognize. He got off at the Garfield Park station and climbed the stairs back to street level. It was 2:40 a.m. The neighborhood was dark, quiet, and cold. Hayes walked 6 blocks, following the street signs, his feet blistered from the oversized sneakers, his legs aching, until he found the address. A 3-story brick building with a faded sign reading New Beginnings Transitional Housing. The front door was locked. Hayes pressed the buzzer. No answer. He pressed it again, holding it longer. A voice crackled through the intercom, irritated and half asleep. "What? My name is Robert Hayes. I was released today. I was told to come here." A long pause. "We're full. Call back in the morning." "Please, sir. I don't have anywhere else to go." Another pause. "Intake hours are 9 to 5. Come back then." The intercom went silent. Hayes stood on the sidewalk, staring at the locked door. He pressed the buzzer again. No response. He sat down on the concrete steps, his back against the cold brick wall, and pulled the windbreaker tighter around his body. The temperature was dropping. His breath came out in visible clouds. He had $34.50 left. He had no phone. He had no one to call even if he had a phone. He sat there all night, shivering, dozing for a few minutes at a time before the cold woke him again. At 6:30 a.m., the sky began to lighten. People started appearing on the street. Workers heading to early shifts, buses rumbling past, a man walking a dog. Hayes stood up slowly, his body stiff and aching, and waited. At 9:05 a.m., a man in his 50s unlocked the front door from the inside. He looked at Hayes, taking in the donated clothes, the plastic bag, the exhausted, desperate expression. "You the guy from last night?" "Yes, sir." The man sighed. "Come in." Inside, the building smelled like bleach, old carpet, and institutional cooking. The man led Hayes to a small office on the first floor, gestured to a plastic chair, and sat behind a desk covered in paperwork. His name tag read Michael Torres, Program Director. Name: Robert Franklin Hayes. Torres typed into a computer, an action so casual and automatic it made Hayes feel even more out of place. "You got a referral? I have a list. From the Department of Corrections." Torres held out his hand. Hayes gave him the printed list. Torres glanced at it and shook his head. "This is a general list. It doesn't mean you have a bed here. We're at capacity. I got 22 men in a building designed for 18. Hayes felt something inside him collapse. "I don't have anywhere else to go. That's not my problem. You need to contact the Illinois Department of Human Services, apply for emergency housing assistance, and get placed on the waiting list. Could take 3 weeks, could take 3 months. Where do I stay until then?" Torres shrugged. "Shelter system. There's one on Madison Street. First come, first served. Hayes sat there, staring at the desk, feeling the full weight of his freedom crushing him. I sat in prison for 40 years. I did everything they told me to do. I followed every rule. And now I'm homeless. Torres's expression softened slightly. Look, I'm not trying to be cruel, but I got 22 men here, all of them in the same situation you're in. I got a budget that covers maybe 60% of what we actually need. I got beds breaking, plumbing leaking, and no funding to fix any of it. The system is overwhelmed. You're one of hundreds of people released this month with nowhere to go. He paused, then reached into a drawer and pulled out a business card. This is a caseworker with the Safer Foundation. They help with re-entry. Call her, explain your situation, and see if she can expedite placement. If a bed opens up here, I'll call you. But I need a phone number. I don't have a phone. Torres wrote something on a notepad and handed it to Hayes. There's a community center 2 blocks south. They have free phones you can use to make calls. Go there, call the caseworker, and check back with me in 3 days. Hayes took the paper, folded it carefully, and stood up. Thank you. He walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk, the morning sun weak and cold. He had $34.50. He had no phone, no place to sleep, and no idea what to do next. He started walking, following the street signs toward the address Torres had mentioned, his feet screaming in pain from the blisters, his mind numb. The shelter on Madison Street was a large brick building that looked like an old warehouse. Hayes arrived at 10:30 a.m. and joined a line of about 40 people waiting outside, men, women, a few teenagers, all of them carrying bags or backpacks or nothing at all. The line moved slowly. Hayes waited for 90 minutes before reaching the front door. Inside, a woman behind a plexiglass window asked for his name and ID. Hayes handed her the temporary ID card issued by the Department of Corrections. She typed into a computer, then looked up. We're full. No beds available. Check back tonight at 5 p.m. If someone doesn't show, you might get a spot. Hayes felt dizzy. What do I do until then? There's a warming center at the church on Pulaski. Open until 3 p.m. Hayes walked back outside, the crowd of people behind him pressing forward. He walked 6 blocks to the church, his vision blurring from exhaustion and hunger. He hadn't eaten since the bus ride the previous evening. A small bag of chips he'd bought at a gas station for $2. The warming center was a large room in the church basement with folding tables, metal chairs, and a few space heaters. There were about 30 people inside, most of them elderly or visibly ill. Hayes sat down at an empty table and rested his head in his hands. A volunteer, a woman in her 60s, approached him. You okay, Han? I'm just tired. You want some coffee? Some soup? Hayes looked up at her, tears filling his eyes for the first time since his release. Yes, ma'am. Please. She brought him a styrofoam cup of black coffee and a bowl of vegetable soup with a sleeve of crackers. Hayes ate slowly, his hands shaking, the warmth of the soup spreading through his body like a miracle. When he finished, he laid his head on the table and fell asleep. He woke 2 hours later to the sound of the volunteer announcing that the center was closing. Hayes stood up, picked up his plastic bag, and walked back outside into the cold afternoon. He had $28 left after buying a bottle of water and a sandwich from a convenience store earlier. He walked aimlessly through the neighborhood, his mind blank, his body moving on autopilot. At 5 p.m., he returned to the shelter on Madison Street. The line was even longer now, stretching around the block. Hayes waited for 2 hours. When he finally reached the front, the woman behind the plexiglass shook her head. Full. Come back tomorrow. Hayes didn't argue. He walked away, his chest tight, his breathing shallow. The temperature was dropping again. He found a bus shelter with a bench and sat down, pulling the windbreaker around him. A bus came and went. Another came and went. He sat there all night, shivering, dozing, waking every few minutes to the sound of traffic or voices or the cold seeping into his bones. This became his routine. Walk all day. Try to find food. Try to find warmth. Try to sleep on benches or in doorways or wherever the police wouldn't move him along. On the third day, Hayes used a phone at the community center to call the caseworker Torres had mentioned. She answered after 4 rings, her voice brisk and efficient. Hayes explained his situation. Released 3 days ago, no housing, no family, sleeping outside. The caseworker sighed. I have 63 active clients right now. I can get you on the list for transitional housing, but the wait is 6 to 8 weeks minimum. In the meantime, you need to apply for emergency assistance through the state. Do you have a social security card? No, ma'am. It's somewhere in my prison file. You'll need to request it from the Social Security Administration. Do you have a birth certificate? No, ma'am. You'll need to request one from the Illinois Department of Public Health. Do you have a permanent address? Hayes felt something inside him break. No, ma'am. I'm homeless. Then you can't apply for benefits without an address. It's a catch-22. I'm sorry. The call ended. Hayes sat in the community center, staring at the phone, understanding for the first time that the system wasn't designed to help him. It was designed to process him, categorize him, and move him through a series of bureaucratic steps that required resources he didn't have. On the 5th day, Hayes collapsed while walking near a bus terminal. A passerby called 911. Paramedics transported him to Cook County Hospital, where he was diagnosed with severe dehydration, malnutrition, and a urinary tract infection. He was given 4 fluids, antibiotics, and a meal. A hospital social worker visited him the next afternoon, a young woman named Jessica Park who looked exhausted and overworked. Mr. Hayes, you can't be discharged until we have a safe placement for you. I don't have one, Hayes said quietly. Jessica reviewed her computer. There's a program for elderly parolees through the Illinois Department of Corrections. It's income-based housing. 20% of whatever you earn, minimum $50 a month. I can get you in, but you'll need to meet with your parole officer first and establish compliance. Hayes nodded. Yes, ma'am. I'll do whatever I need to do. Jessica made several phone calls while Hayes waited in the hospital bed. 2 hours later, she returned. You have an appointment with your parole officer tomorrow at 9 a.m. If you show up and you're compliant, they'll approve you for the elderly parolees program. There's a bed available in a facility on the south side. It's not much, but it's a roof. Hayes felt tears streaming down his face. Thank you. The program was located in a converted motel on South Cottage Grove Avenue, a single-story building with peeling paint and cracked asphalt. Hayes was assigned a small room with a bathroom, a microwave, a mini fridge, and a twin bed. The room smelled like mildew and old smoke, but it was warm and it was his. Meals were provided twice a day in a communal dining room. Breakfast at 7:30 a.m., dinner at 6 p.m. The food was bland and institutional, but it was food. There were 19 other residents, all of them men and women over 60, all of them recently released from Illinois prisons, all of them navigating the same impossible reentry process. Hayes attended mandatory orientation meetings, job readiness workshops, and parole compliance check-ins. He learned how to write a resume that acknowledged his incarceration without immediately disqualifying him. He learned how to explain a 40-year gap in employment. He learned that most employers would not hire him regardless of how well he explained it. 3 months after his release, Hayes was hired as a part-time janitor at a community center in Englewood, earning $11 an hour for 20 hours a week. The work was physically exhausting. Mopping floors, scrubbing toilets, emptying trash, lifting boxes, but he showed up every day, arriving 15 minutes early, staying 15 minutes late, never complaining. His supervisor, a man named Terrell Jackson who had himself been incarcerated for 12 years, offered Hayes patient instruction and quiet encouragement. You're doing good, Robert. Keep showing up. That's all you gotta do. Hayes earned $880 a month before taxes. After taxes, he took home about $740. 20% of that went to the Transitional Housing Program, $148. The rest went to food, bus fare, and the slow, agonizing process of obtaining identification documents. He spent $60 requesting his birth certificate from the Illinois Department of Public Health. He spent another $40 applying for a replacement Social Security card. He spent $30 on a state ID card. Every transaction required forms, appointments, waiting periods, and fees that consumed his limited income. 6 months after his release, Hayes reached out to his sister, Renee. She was 68 years old, living in a small apartment in Gary, Indiana, working part-time as a home health aide. Hayes had written her 3 letters from prison over the years. She had responded to one. He called her from a phone at the community center, his hands shaking as he dialed the number he'd found through the caseworker's help. Renee answered on the 4th ring. "Hello, Renee, it's Robert." A long silence. "I heard you got out." "Yes, 6 months ago." Another silence. "What do you want, Robert?" Hayes closed his eyes. "I just wanted to talk, to hear your voice, to tell you I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't bring Mama back. Sorry doesn't change what you did. I know. You killed a man, Robert. You helped kill a man. And Mama spent the rest of her life carrying that shame." Hayes felt his throat tighten. "I know. I think about it every day." Renee's voice softened slightly. "Where are you staying?" "A transitional housing program on the south side." "You working?" "Part-time. Janitorial work." Renee sighed. "I don't have money to help you. I'm barely making it myself. I'm not asking for money. I just wanted you to know I'm out. That I'm trying." Another silence, longer this time. "I'll think about seeing you, but I'm not ready yet. Maybe in a few months." The call ended. Hayes sat in the community center, staring at the phone, feeling the weight of 40 years pressing down on him. His sister wasn't ready. His mother was dead. Leonard Chen was dead. Marcus Thompson was dead. Hayes was 74 years old, working part-time for $11 an hour, living in a converted motel, and trying to survive in a world that had moved on without him. 1 year after his release, Robert Franklin Hayes was still living in the transitional housing program. He was still working as a janitor, still reporting to his parole officer every 2 weeks, still navigating a society that felt completely alien. He had gained 12 pounds from regular meals. His blood pressure was controlled with medication provided by a community health clinic. His urinary tract infection had been treated and resolved. He attended a weekly support group for elderly formerly incarcerated individuals, sitting in a circle of men and women who understood the crushing weight of reentry and the impossibility of recovering lost decades. He had learned to use a basic cell phone, though he rarely received calls. He had obtained a state ID card, a social security card, and a birth certificate. He had saved $317, money he kept in an envelope hidden in his dresser drawer. He didn't know what he was saving for. He just knew that having it made him feel slightly less vulnerable, slightly less powerless. He still woke at 5:30 every morning, a reflex ingrained by 40 years of prison routine. He still felt the muscle memory of hypervigilance, the constant awareness of his surroundings, the reflexive tension at loud noises or sudden movements. Freedom, he had learned, was not the absence of walls. It was the slow, exhausting work of building a life from nothing, with almost no resources, almost no support, and no guarantee that any of it would matter. Hayes had not reconciled with his sister. She had not called back. He had not visited his mother's grave because he didn't have the money for transportation to the cemetery. He had not received forgiveness from Leonard Chen's family, nor did he expect to. He carried the weight of that death every day, a burden that prison had not lessened and freedom had not resolved. Robert Franklin Hayes was not redeemed. He was not rehabilitated in any triumphant movie-ending sense. He was simply 74 years old, alive, and surviving in a society that had written him off 40 years ago and had no interest in making space for him now. He walked out of Menard Correctional Center with $75 and nowhere to go. 1 year later, he had a room, a job, and $317 saved. It wasn't much. It wasn't justice. It wasn't restoration. But he was still here. He showed up for work. He paid his rent. He followed the rules. And every night, lying in the narrow bed in his small room in the converted motel, listening to the sound of traffic and voices and the hum of the city that had continued without him, he closed his eyes and reminded himself that he had survived another day. That was all he had. And for now, it was all he could manage.